Installing new brake tubing is fairly straightforward. Planning ahead before removing the old tubing can save time and money. Pay attention to the routing of the original tubing. If it was routed in a way that caused a hole or rubs against another component, reroute the line differently to prevent a reoccurrence. The following screens describe tips that will help you to install brake tubing more efficiently. While the fittings are still clamped, clean both fittings on the tube. Then disconnect the fittings with a flare nut wrench. If the tube is attached to a hose, hold the hose fitting with another flare nut wrench. Plug the open ports on the vehicle. Next, remove the mounting clips and tubing. Check the clips and the screws for damage or corrosion. If you find damage or corrosion, you will need to replace the unusable hardware. Save any protective shields around the tubing for reuse. You can replace the tubing with either OEM or fabricated tubing. If you need to fabricate the tubing, save the original for measuring purposes. Now we are going to install the tubing. OEM tubing is pre-formed tubing provided by the manufacturer for the specific vehicle and application. If OEM tubing is unavailable, you will need to fabricate tubing to fit. You will learn how to fabricate tubing next. Place the OEM tubing on the chassis and loosely attach the clips. Attach the fittings tightly at both ends of the tubing with the flare nut wrench. Finally, tighten the clips. Your first choice for replacement tubing is to use OEM pre-formed tubing. If this is not available, standard tubing in pre-cut lengths with flared connections and nuts can be used. However, these lines come in only predetermined lengths that may be too long or short, which may make them a bit difficult to fit. You can also cut your tubing from a bulk roll for an exact fit. If you do this, make sure you leave extra line for flared connections and bends. Most tubing is made from 3/16 inch (0.48 centimeters) diameter and must always be double wall steel. Begin by lining a string up next to the original tubing. Measure the string and add a 1/4 inch (0.64 centimeters) for each flare. Do not lay the roll on a flat surface. Instead, stand it on end and unroll it until you get the required length needed. You should never lay the roll flat and pull on it. This will cause kinks and twists. Once you have unrolled the tubing to the correct length, mark the tubing. Attach a tubing cutter to the tubing where it is marked. Turn the cutter around the tubing to cut it, tightening the cutter a little with every other revolution of the tool. Never use a hacksaw or other device. It could damage the tubing. Also, this is a rolling cut, not a pressure cut. Over-tightening the tool may damage the tool or the tubing. Holding the tubing downward, remove any sharp edges and burrs using a reaming tool. Then blow compressed air through the tubing to remove any debris. Whether you are using pre-cut or fabricated lengths of tubing, the tubing will most likely need to be bent to the same shape as the original tubing. Most tubing can be bent by hand to form slight curves. However, when you need to make sharper curves, you will need to use a tool to keep from kinking the tubing. On small diameter tubing, you may use either a bending spring or a tubing bender. On large diameter tubing, you will need to use a tubing bender. Allow enough clearance around the exhaust and suspension components when bending the tubing. Also, when making bends, leave an additional 1 1/2 inches, 3.81 centimeters, of straight tubing at the end so there is enough length to make flared connections. To use a bending spring for bending tubing, place the tubing inside the spring and bend it by hand. You should bend it further than you need and then back it off to the correct angle. This will make it easier for you to remove the tubing from the spring. You should also bend the tubing prior to creating flares whenever possible. Otherwise, you will need to use a larger diameter spring and it will be more difficult to make the bend. To make sharper bends or bends on a larger diameter tubing, you should use a tubing bender. Feed the tubing into the tool to the exact location where the bend is needed. Clamp down on the tubing to make the bend.
Flare connections are formed at the end of the tubing because they can withstand the high pressures of the hydraulic system. There are two types of flare connections, double and ISO. Both flare connections may be found on the same vehicle, but they are not interchangeable. Select each button to learn more. When finished, select Next to continue.
Double flared connections are commonly used for U.S. standard lines and fittings. When using double flared connections, the fittings are gold, silver, or copper in color. ISO flared connections, also known as bubble flared connections, are used on metric lines and fittings. Fittings for ISO flared connections are typically green or blue in color. There are two tools we will cover to create flared connections. Either tool can be used to make either flared connection. We will show you how to create a double flared connection using a manual flaring tool. Then we will show you how to create an ISO flared connection using a hydraulic flaring tool. However, before you make any flared connections, you must add the fittings or nuts to the tubing with the fitting facing the appropriate ends.
First, we will show you how to create a double flare connection using a manual flaring tool. The name double flare results from the fact that the tubing is flared twice. Select each tab for more information. When finished, select Next to continue.
First, make sure the flare nut is on the tubing. Put the tubing through the correct sized hole in the flaring bar. Place the appropriate die next to the tubing on the flaring bar with the pin facing up. Adjust the tubing so it protrudes through to the same height as the first level on the die. Secure the tubing in the flaring bar. Place the die pin into the end of the tubing. Put the yoke assembly over the flaring bar and center over the die. Tighten the handle on the yoke until the die touches the flaring bar. Loosen the yoke and pull out the die. Then retighten the yoke so that the swivel head folds the tubing in on itself. This completes the double flared connection. Make sure the flare is formed evenly and there are no cracks in the flared end of the tubing. The process to make an ISO flared connection is similar. The primary difference is that you use a slightly different tool and you don't fold the tubing in on itself. See the tool instructions for further details.
Now that you have learned the steps to this procedure, watch the video to see the entire process. Select Next when you are ready to continue. Now we will show you how to create an ISO flare connection using a hydraulic flaring tool. Select each tab for more information. When finished, select Next to continue.
Place the correct die over the tubing. The tubing should be flush with the outer edge of the die. Place the die with the tubing into the hydraulic flaring tool and secure. Put the appropriate male bubble flaring adapter into the flaring tool and tighten the yoke. Close the hydraulic valve and pump the handle until the adapter touches the die. Loosen the yoke and pull out the die. Then retighten the yoke so that the swivel head folds the tubing in on itself. This completes the double flared connection. Make sure the flare is formed evenly and there are no cracks in the flared end of the tubing. The process to make an ISO flared connection is similar. The primary difference is that you use a slightly different tool and you don't fold the tubing in on itself. See the tool instructions for further details.
Now that you have learned the steps to this procedure, watch the video to see the entire process. Select Next when you are ready to continue.